Good morning and welcome to the world headquarters of Wine Spectator magazine. I'm Tom Matthews, executive editor, and I'm glad that you're with us for our Facebook Live chat today. Today we're going to be tasting Spanish wines from Rioja, which is close to my heart because I'm the lead taster on the wines of Spain. And we're going to meet with Víctor Urrutia from CVNE. Now, many people have asked me, what does it take to make a Wine Spectator Wine of the Year? Well, Victor is one of the few people who knows because his CVNE Rioja Imperial Grand Reserva 2004 was the first ever Spanish wine named as Wine of the Year. It was our number one in the top 100 of 2013. So Victor, welcome to New York.
Thank you,
for
Tom.
joining me. What was it like to make the Wine of the Year?
It was a huge deal, without question. Huge deal for CVNE. I think a huge deal for Spain as well. To be the first Spanish winery to receive that award was nothing short of extraordinary. Spain makes amazing wines, but we also produce some wines that are perhaps less interesting. And I think it's my task, my obligation to focus on those that are good. And to get this recognition is a huge endorsement for the kind of things that Spain can do. So huge deal.
But CVNE is not a one-hit wonder. The Rioja Grand Reserva 2010 was number 22 on the 2016 list just last year. And the Monopole, a white wine that we're going to taste today, the 2013 was number 64 on the 2014 list. Which is to say that CVNE makes wines for everybody. Different price points, different styles, but all deeply rooted in Rioja and the tradition of Rioja. Because how old is the winery?
Founded in 1879 by my great-grandparents. So my math is terrible. So 140 or so years ago, so a long time ago.
And you're the fifth generation.
Fifth generation, that's right.
Still family owned. So we are going to taste through kind of the entry level of CVNE's Rioja lines, a white, a Crianza, and a Reserva. So why don't we start with the white?
Sure.
Victor, tell us a little bit about Monopole and white wine in Rioja.
Okay. Monopole is actually the oldest white wine brand in Spain. The name was registered in 1915, and we spent a fortune every year protecting it, but of course Monopole is a beautiful name and everybody wants to be associated with that. Rioja is better known for its reds, but in fact we've been making whites for as long as we've been making reds.
What is the percentage red versus white?
Well, for us it's small. For us it's maybe 10% white. In the past it was far more. In fact, even in some years it was nearly 50%
Really?
white. Yeah, maybe 50 or so years ago. For Rioja overall, I think it's probably even less than 10%. So, but it's coming up. People are getting more and more interested in Rioja whites because I think they can be very good.
And Viura is the grape that's the backbone for...
Yeah, there's some white Grenache, some Malvasia, but it's mostly Viura. We've been allowed to plant Sauvignon Blanc, Verdejo, and Chardonnay. We've done none of that. I think it's not really that appropriate for us in Rioja. I think the future for us in Spain overall is to focus on the varieties that we've been harvesting for centuries. To take something else from a different country or from a different region for us in Rioja, it might appeal to some marketing managers and some corporations, but I don't think it's the right way forwards. I think we should focus on what we've been doing forever. And Viura is what we've been doing for a long time.
So the Monopole that earned its spot in the top 100 was the modern iteration. 100% Viura, stainless steel fermented, released young, fresh, steely, hints of mineral and floral, and
That's
a beautiful value at about $13.
I often find that many whites nowadays, made across the world, have very similar fruit profiles, sort of many exotic fruits, a bit of sugar, very low acidity, very approachable. Certainly have to be drunk young. They won't be able to age very well, but they can be a bit sickly. And honestly, a lot of them are very similar. I think that they're absolutely fine, nothing wrong with them. But it's good to find something which is different. I wouldn't say unique. Unique is a big word to use, but something different. And I think this wine has amazing acidity, which pulls back a lot of people. But if you're going to drink white with food, as I think you should, you need some acidity to cut through the food that is on your plate. And the fruit doesn't need to blow up in your face. You know, I think there's a lot to be said for nuance and for balance and for subtlety. And these are the things that we try to find in monopole. Yeah.
Now, in this particular bottling, talk about distinctive, you've gone back to the future to kind of create a style that you made early in the 20th century.
Yeah.
Tell us what makes this one a little different from the regular monopole that we find in the stores.
Well, monopole in the past, many years ago, used to be made with some sherry thrown into the blend, and then it was aged for a long time in very old oak. We stopped doing this wine because it just became completely unfashionable. People wanted something much more approachable. But we thought this is a shame to not make this style of wine, because we did have some bottles from the past and they were amazing. So we thought, why don't we do this wine again in very small amounts? So we called the winemaker who was making this wine from the 40s until the 70s, early 70s, Ezekiel Garcia. You know, the name is very evocative as well. And Ezekiel is still around. He's retired, but he still knows he knows his stuff. So we pulled him out of retirement, drafted him back into CVNE. He was very excited about the idea, and he helps us blend the wine again. So we bought some sherry, we bought the butts, brought them over. This, of course, is not, strictly speaking, 100% legal with the appellation. We're bending the rules a bit. We do actually have letters from the appellation from 40 years ago authorizing us to do this.
Now, when some people think sherry, they might think cream sherry or Oloroso, some old, dark, rich.
No.
Not this. What kind of sherry are you putting in here?
Manzanilla, which is bone dry, has some saltiness to it. It's pungent, but it's very pure, very fine. It's alcoholic, but we must keep the wine balanced. It cannot be more than 14% alcohol. Yeah.
Well, in your mind, what does the sherry bring to the white?
I think it adds a bit of savouriness. It adds a bit of alcohol, which in the past was always necessary, often necessary in Aro. The climate in Aro is very cool, and often we had the grapes would come in at 11% alcohol, 11 or low 12s, to just give it that extra degree of alcohol. It was very useful. People often think that Spanish wines are alcoholic and powerful, but that's not always the case. You know, sometimes that's the assumption about Spanish wines. But wines from Rioja, particularly from Rioja Alta and Alvesa, are actually very cool climate wines, and they have much more in common, I think, with Burgundy than they do with powerful Mediterranean wines. So the sherry helped give the wine a bit more backbone, and a bit more structure. You know,
What would you pair with this with in terms of food?
Fish, lobster, anything that comes out of the sea, particularly if it has a lot of cream, a lot of butter. If it's slightly heavy, I think the savouriness here of the wine and the acidity cuts through all of that.
I would love it with a sliced Iberico ham,
Of course.
which has that salty note that picks up with the wine.
Delicious.
So just to remind our viewers who may not taste many wines at a time how we do it, there's the classic 4 S's: the see, the swirl, the sniff, and the sip. Each step gives you a little bit different information. Each step helps create a complete picture of the wine. In this case, we see that it has a light gold, almost a touch of rosiness to it.
That's right, yeah.
The aromas are quite pungent and fresh. The briny note that Victor talks about, I get a little peach and floral. Thanks to the sherry addition, it's quite full-bodied on the palate, but none of the toasty or buttery notes that you get from oak. It's more mineral and savory elements that keep it fresh and clean through the finish. It's different.
Yeah.
Apparently your mom didn't like it very much.
No, she prefers the current style. Do you know, I think this is interesting for people for people that are passionate about wine, and who have seen a ton of modern style whites, and they're looking for something a bit different.
Right.
I think that's probably who this wine is for. Yeah.
Well, that's a wonderful thing about the wine world, always innovating, but sometimes innovating towards the past instead of only towards the future.
Yeah, it's a strange way of doing it, but it sort of makes sense for us. Yeah.
And then, as you'll notice, I spit after I taste because that's the way you remember what you drink. So, Victor, let's move on to the bread and butter of Rioja, the red wines, based largely on Tempranillo.
Yes.
What makes Tempranillo special in your mind?
I think Tempranillo is very versatile as a variety. It's hard to pin down. Some people make it as a powerful red with a lot of fruit and perhaps high alcohol levels. On the other end of the spectrum, some people have it very thin, very low alcohol, very low fruit. We want to keep it somewhere in the middle. Yeah, something that is approachable and basically delicious. That's how it should be for us. Yeah, so, well, that's easier said than done, and often it is. But this wine needs to be delicious. Sometimes I draw a comparison between Crianza and non-vintage champagne. I think non-vintage champagne, well, of course, they're completely different. Wine is white and sparkling, but the better non-vintage champagnes, they always need to have a minimum consistency. Yeah, they cannot be below a certain level of quality. You could argue that sometimes they can't go above a certain level either. Yeah, but they need to be always not the same. Yeah, but there's a saying in Spain which is "cune nunca falla," which translated means "cune never fails, it never goes wrong." Yeah, and I've heard that from old timers and all kinds of people, and I love that. What it tells you is that you're always going to be okay with cune, with this particular wine.
Well, I think that champagne achieves that consistency by blending different grapes, different vineyards within the region, and even different vintages in the case of their non-vintage blends. You don't blend vintages.
The way we achieve that consistency is with our barrel aging.
And blending from grapes from different areas around the region of Rioja.
We vinify around 500 hectares that belong to us, and we buy that same equivalent amount of fruit.
So 1,000 hectares, that
gives you so much to play with.
2,000 acres, 2,500 acres of grapes.
So to us it's huge, and managing that is complicated, to say the least.
Rioja has 3 subzones: Rioja Alta, which is where you're located.
Yes.
In the north, Rioja Alavesa in the middle, and then Rioja Baja, a warmer section in the south.
Yes.
Do you use grapes from all 3 regions in this wine?
In the past, we had some grapes. We had our own vineyards in Rioja Baja. We practically don't have any there anymore. They made sense many years ago. Again, when we had very cool vintages in Aro, in Rioja Alta. Nowadays, with climate change, we get fewer and fewer of those. So we don't really need that much fruit from Rioja Baja. There's some amazing producers and amazing fruit in Rioja Baja. That has to be said. But this wine, I think, has more. It's more characteristic of Rioja Alta. So you will find in this wine some acidity. The fruit is not cloying and all over the place. It's more sort of discreet, I think. Again, here the beauty is in the balance and the ease with which you can just drink this wine.
And what does Crianza tell us about the wine? It's a word that doesn't have a strict English translation, but it's legally defined in Spain.
In Spain, Crianza means the wine has to age for a minimum of 12 months in oak and another 12 months elsewhere before you bottle it. Typically, we will give it a year plus in oak, perhaps a bit more, and then some time to sort of blend all together in a concrete vat to make it all come together. So, non-vintage champagne, they blend different vintages to give you the same product every year. We don't give you the same product every year, but it is similar from one vintage to another. It should be anyway. And we achieve that by blending a lot of fruit from different parts of Rioja Alta mostly, but also by just keeping it in barrel for so long and having so many barrels in which we blend the wine. That gives us the consistency that you see in Crianza year in, year out. But of course, it's fun to see the differences from one vintage to another, and as the wine ages, of course, that changes too. Yeah?
And some vintages are better or at least easier than others.
Of course,
this 14 was a pretty difficult vintage for Rioja.
Tough vintage. I think 14 is a vintage of 2 halves. We started out okay, it was sunny, it was good. So the wines made in the first 2 weeks are outstanding. Then it started raining, and what came in after that was thinner, lighter, not as powerful as what came in before. So really a tale of 2 vintages is 2014.
Now I have reviewed this wine in blind tastings at Wine Spectator. We are tasting the wines non-blind, and that's important to get information, to understand the wines better, to hear the winemaker, the owner, explain why this wine is like what it is. But for the official reviews, it's always independent blind tastings. And this wine, the 2014 Crianza, scored 88 points, or very good, and sells for $13, which I consider to be excellent value.
Thank you. That's what we're about. Spain overall, I think, gives you very good value. For us, it's important to be democratic and to try and over-deliver for the quality that we have. I think we sort of have to, because we're not as well known as the better known parts of France or Italy. So we sort of have to do that. But I'm fine with that.
It's supple, it's fresh, it has juicy acidity, black cherry fruit, hints of tobacco that keep it not too fruity, not too sweet. Really good food wine for lighter dishes and drink it now.
Exactly.
So let's move on to the 2013 Reserva. Reserva sounds like it's a step up from Crianza.
Yep.
And it requires different legal
That's right.
regulations as well.
The legal technicalities can be confusing, even for us. So, yeah, it's a shame, but it's what we have. You know, it can be confusing. I guess the New World is more straightforward in terms of how it's classified, and that makes it
sure,
easier.
and California Reserve means nothing. You can just put it on the label, and
Really?
it's up to you. Here, it actually means something, even if it's complicated.
Right. So I guess, well, it's good that we have it, I think. Yeah. And the traditional classification in Spain, you start with a basic wine, which we called cosecha, which means literally harvest. We don't do that for the reds. We start our entry level is with Crianza. Next step up from Crianza would be Reserva. Now, Reserva needs to be aged for a minimum of 3 years between oak, so barrel, not any kind of barrel, 300 bottle barrel, and aged in bottle as well. So some people have combination, minimum 1 year in barrel. In our case, we keep the wine from up to between 1 year and 2 years in barrel, and then we bottle it, and we keep it in bottle, and we only release it really in its 4th year. Yeah? So we released the 2013 literally just last month, and this is what we're going to be selling this year. So
in terms of production, how many cases of Crianza versus cases of Reserva?
I forget how much we do of Crianza, but Crianza maybe we're doing about 200,000 cases, of which we sell most in Spain. This is the wine you'll find throughout Spain in bars and restaurants, Crianza. And the Reserva, we do, let me think, how much do we produce? We do about 50,000 cases in a good year, so it's far less.
So 25%.
Yeah.
And how do you decide in the winery which barrels or wines are going to go into the Crianza versus Reserva?
Better fruit, and we tend to know where that comes from, will go into the Reserva. That's pretty much the case year in, year out. It goes into newer barrels and better barrels. When these barrels become old, we pass them on to the Cuna Crianza. So the fruit is better, the barrels are newer and better. We're not really in favour of putting Cuna Crianza in brand new barrels.
Right.
The oak just eats up the fruit, I think. Yeah. The Reserva fruit is more concentrated, more powerful. It can withstand the new oak much better. But we have a combination of old and new barrels.
And American oak and French oak.
American oak has always been very important for us, and always will be. It goes better, I think, with Tempranillo. It's more flattering, has that nuance of the vanilla and the toastiness. It just works better, I think. Yeah? And historically, we've always done it that way. So we're happy to stick with that.
So let's try the Reserva. Already you can see that it has a denser color, darker color, indicating a little more concentration in the wine. Even though it's a year older, it's 13, it seems almost younger in terms of its intensity.
The wine is vinified for longer, the fruit can withstand that, so it takes longer to make. Typically this one we'll vinify for 2-3 weeks max, whereas the Reserva is vinified for a minimum of 3 weeks, so you get more extraction out of the fruit. Again, you've got to be careful of that, not over-extract.
Well, and you can find that on the palate. The tannins are more present, the wine has more richness in texture, This wine, in my blind tasting, scored 89 points, or a point higher, and it sells in this market for $28. It probably will age longer if you want to keep it in your cellar. But again, as with most Riojas, it's pretty much ready to drink when it's released.
That's the idea. I think it's perfect for drinking now. Sounds like a cliche, everybody says that, but it will become better with age. But really it will. You know, the fruit will blend in better. It has a nice soft finish to it. I think it's okay now. It's a cool vintage. You know, we finished November.
Tough vintage.
Yeah, tough vintage as well.
Even maybe tougher than 14.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm quite happy because for a tough vintage, it's a pleasant drinking wine. You know? We made no Imperial in 2013.
Imperial being the wine that won the Wine of the Year, the top of their range, but only made in the best vintages.
Yeah, so with Imperial was super strict, and it's made in tiny amounts. So I suppose one way of looking at it is that the fruit that would have gone normally into Imperial this time went into the Cune Reserva. But it didn't make the cut for Imperial. I think it's again, it's also delicious. It's more complex than the Cune.
And a little more structured, so it can
It has more
stand up
structure to it.
to heartier food.
Yeah.
Maybe a leg of lamb, or
That's right. Yeah, even a
pork
steak.
shoulder.
Why not? Yeah.
yeah.
I think this is also textbook Rioja. Yeah. I think that's important to follow a certain style. The fruit with time will fade away. It will become more gamey, more savoury, more complex. I think the window for drinking this wine is maybe 10, 15 years, which is a lot.
So Rioja offers many different styles. You can find single varietal wines now, Garnacha or Graciana, which used to be only blending grapes. You can find wines that are made in a very contemporary style, as Victor said, with very ripe fruit, matured in new French oak barrels that taste a little bit like the California Cabernet. The whites are all over the map, from the lighter crisp style like Monopole to barrel fermented versions that taste a little bit like Chardonnay, even from Burgundy. So it's a very diverse region with a lot of different wines, but really good value in across the board. Sounds like we have a question from our Facebook audience. Lexi?
So Jonathan Garcia Lima wants to know about how the style of Rioja has changed and how has that affected the ageability of the wines.
Good question. In the past, and I'm thinking maybe 100 years ago, I think you would find less fruit in Riojas overall. And of course, 100 years ago, you only had maybe 10, 15 wineries in Rioja. Cune is one of them. And these wines typically were aged in barrel for a longer time and bottled later. Those wines tend to be perhaps, on the nose you would find more earthiness, leather. As time goes on, we have been bottling the wines sooner. They spend a bit less time in barrel, but of course the barrels have become newer as well. So you could argue that overall Rioja over 100 years has become slightly more modern in the sense that you see more fruit, and that the influence of oak is not as massive as it was in the past. And people are paying more attention as well to specific vineyards, specific sub-appellations, if you want, little villages, particularly in northern Rioja. I think our wines are actually not too different from how they were 100 years ago. They have slightly modernized, but we have pretty much stuck to our guns. We've tried to make the wines better where technology has allowed us to make them better. I think some newer producers have they've eschewed the historic classification of Crianza Reserva that we were talking about. I said, well, I don't need that, doesn't help me. I'll just produce a wine every year and label it as I see fit. And I think that's all good. You know, I think it's good that we become more diverse. Often the risk is that I wouldn't say you lose the personality, you know, but you do something that is so modern that it risks being too international, and that it could have been made anywhere. I think that the best new Rioja producers don't fall in that trap. They have a lot of personality, but to somebody that is not accustomed to them, they might be surprised by the level of concentration and fruit that they see in these wines. they think, oh, this could be from California. But of course, once you dive into that, you can see that it's not a California wine, that it's a Rioja wine. It's just very different from what you had in the past. And I think all these things are good. So there's a lot going on, and I think it's rewarding for a wine lover to dive in and to see what's available, because there's certainly much more than there was 30, 40, 50 years ago.
And in terms of ageability, I think that one of the great advantages of Rioja is that the bodega, the winery, generally keeps the wine in their own cellars until they feel it's ready to drink. So Victor's now releasing 2014s and even 2013s or older vintages, whereas if you went to California or even Bordeaux, you'd have a much younger vintage and then you'd have to do the aging. In our experience tasting, say, Old Imperial together, we see that Rioja has a pretty fast aging curve at the beginning, first 3 to 5 years, and then hits a long plateau and stays there for 10, 20, 30 years or more before finally declining. So it's different than a Bordeaux, which might take slower to get to the peak, but might not last much longer, if any.
I think you could argue that Bordeaux and Burgundy have changed even more than Rioja has. Bordeaux is from 50 years ago, even when drunk young. Of course, I wasn't there at the time. But from what I've seen from these aged wines, I think Bordeaux has changed a lot more than what people expect. And you could argue that they've become far better, or not. That depends on your opinion, and there's hundreds of those. But I don't think Rioja has changed that much. And honestly, I'm convinced that good Rioja ages phenomenally. Like you say, it ages faster than traditional Bordeaux and Burgundy. But once it plateaus, it becomes, it evolves very slowly, it becomes very nuanced, and it becomes great. And classic old Riojas from the good properties have nothing to be embarrassed about when compared to the very best from Bordeaux and Burgundy. Of this I'm convinced. We have Vignerals and Imperials from the 50s and the 60s that are stunning. And this is really what we should be doing. Try to make wines that are as good as those, whether it's in a modern style or in a newer style. I think if the wine after 30, 40 years becomes something close to that, then we're doing it right. If not, then we're not. Hope that answers the question in a rather long-winded way.
Another question, Lexi?
Yes, we actually have 2 questions. So the first one actually comes from a familiar face to Wine Spectator. Tom's wife, Sarah Matthews, is tuning in, and she wants to know from Victor, have you noticed any difference in your vineyards due to climate change? And if so, what plans are you making to adjust to that?
Oof. We measure the vintage, the harvest date, and the alcohol levels. We have done at CVNE since forever, and if you map it, there's a trend. We are harvesting sooner, and the alcohol level has been creeping up. So, and that is a fact. You could look at our old Vignerals. It's a different property that we haven't tasted at today, and Vigneral 81 was 14.3% alcohol. The Vignerals from the 60s, they had higher alcohol as well. So has it changed the style of the wine, how we're making it? Not so much. But there's a reality that we're harvesting sooner. How are we coping with that? So far, we have avoided irrigating as a philosophy, and I'd like to continue doing that. It does present problems, particularly in vineyards in warmer regions, but we haven't really solved that problem yet. I think the solution is to continue planting your own vineyards. We're doing that more and more. We're buying vineyards. We're looking after them better. We're focusing all the new vineyards that we're buying in cooler regions near Aro and near the mountain range in northern Rioja.
Because you have altitude, you can go higher.
We can do that, yes. We're going back to goblet plantations. I think that allows you, paradoxically, I think it can allow you to manage better what you have.
So by goblet, he means the bush vines that grow each individually, which is the traditional form of Rioja vineyards, which were replaced by the vines on the wires that you see in California and Bordeaux. So again, back to the past in order to move better into the future.
Much of our future is in our past. But truly, the problems raised by climate change, I don't think we know how to deal with them properly. What we are seeing as well is a much more frequent freak weather patterns. At Contino and other of our properties, the 2013 vintage was practically wiped out by a hailstorm September 5th, size of golf balls. Never seen that before.
All right, pretty good segue to another question that we have in the comments. Juan Osuna wants to know if CVNE has ever planned to produce wine outside of Spain, maybe in an area with similar weather or soil conditions.
Well, we've thought about it, and it sounds amazing, the possibility of doing that. I'd love to, but I think we should stick to our guns, at least for the time being. There's so much more that we could do in Rioja. This year we bought, and it's staggering, we bought 112 hectares in Rioja. And we need to know what to do with them. You need to know how to manage them better to get the best fruit out of them. So that will take up a lot of our time. I would love to be able to do more things outside of Rioja, perhaps more in Spain. I think there's huge opportunities in Spain. And elsewhere, yes, of course. But in the end, you ask yourself, are we going to be able to go to a different country and do things better than the people there? I don't know. I think it's presumptuous to think that we could do that.
Especially if you've been around for 100 years or more in your own region and still feel like you're got room to improve.
Definitely. There's always room for improvement. So, who knows? Maybe it's for my kids.
Well, thank you, Victor, for this tour of Rioja.
You're very welcome.
I look at some of its complexities, some of what it offers. We hope you'll go out and try a bottle just to see what we're talking about. And thank you for joining us on this Facebook Live at Wine Spectator. I'm Tom Matthews. See you next time.